Hello there, and welcome to the first edition of the Bread Garden Market Wine and Cheese Club. This is the first video for the Vinofiles Wine Club. The Vinofiles Wine Club is a club for collectors, people who want to be collectors, or people who just like kind of really nice, well-made, high-end wine. For the first edition of this, we are actually doing Big Cali Cabs. Why did we choose Cabernet Sauvignon? Well, to put it quite simply, it is the king of red wines in the United States, certainly, and in other parts of the world, in particular Bordeaux. Cabernet is known for its long-lived wines, some of the best Cabernets in California, and in Washington, another great spot for cabs in the United States. Can age for 10, 15, or even 20 years. They are big, they're bold, they're very complex. Sometimes very structured and tannic, and it's that tannin that actually gives them, in part, their great ageability. All right, so why does Cabernet produce some of the best wines in the world? There are a number of reasons for that. Cabernet tends to be a very small but very thick-skinned grape, so there's a lot of dry matter in comparison to the juice that you get out of the grape. So when the grape skins are macerating on the juice, you get a very deep color, and it helps to produce all that tannin that we've been talking about. And then Cab itself loves warm weather. It is one of the latest ripening grape in the world, and because of its late ripening preference, it enjoys really warm weather. That's why Cab tends to grow very well in places like Napa Valley, Paso Robles, certain parts of Bordeaux, certain parts of Washington. That's also why you don't see Cab grown in, say, Germany or in Champagne or England, because of the very cool weather. Cabernet needs to be picked at optimal ripeness to achieve proper balance and structure. If you pick Cabernet too early, you'll get kind of more green flavors, bell peppery, really stemmy. The tannins could be overly astringent, and then you don't get the fruit. So the timing of when you pick Cabernet is of optimal importance. And then certainly after that, where it's grown, how it's aged, whether you use stainless steel vats, cement tanks, or barrels. The best aged cabs tend to be aged in barrel for a certain number of years. That could be anywhere from 1 to 2 years, up to 3 to 4. All right, so we talked about the actual grape itself. What gives it its kind of characteristics. So now we're going to move on to specifically what types of cabs we're going to be talking about. And when you're talking about Big Cali cabs, you could certainly go into Paso Robles, you can go into Monterey, other Central Coast wineries. You can talk about the North Coast and Lake County, which is a huge up-and-coming region in terms of great cab to great value. But really, the king of Cabernet in California, in terms of region, is Napa Valley. Now, this is not a surprise to anybody. Napa Valley is world famous as a Cabernet wine region and a wine region in general. Without question, the best Cabernets in the country and some of the best Cabernets in the world come from Napa Valley. Despite its reputation, it's an incredibly small area. Napa Valley is only about 15 miles long. About 30 miles long and about 5 miles wide at its widest area. So we're talking about a great amount of Cabernet, high quality Cabernet coming out of a region that is actually very, very small, which is not unusual. Napa Valley itself has what we call 16 different AVAs within Napa Valley. And when I'm talking about AVAs, what are we talking about? We're talking about American viticultural areas. American viticultural areas are basically areas throughout the country, but in this case we're talking about Napa Valley, that have their own distinct climate, their own distinct terroir. So basically it's an area that has enough differentiating factors in it to give it its own name. So for example, you have Napa Valley, which is a very general American viticultural area, or AVA. And then within Napa Valley, you have like Stag's Leap District, or Rutherford, or Atlas Peak, or Wild Horse. So those are kind of narrower regions. So think about like concentric circles. So you have California as a state, also as an American viticultural area. Within California, you have different subregions like Napa or Sonoma or Paso Robles. And then in each of those regions, like Napa, you have further subregions like Stag's Leap, like Oakville, like Rutherford. Generally speaking, the further you get into these concentric circles, the higher the quality, the more distinct the flavor, the taste, and the characteristics that kind of go into these wines. If you are a fan of European wines, they have the same type of classification systems all over the world. So in France, for example, you have the AOC, the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, and you have Bordeaux. And then within Bordeaux, you have Saint Julien, you have Margaux, you have the Medoc, you have Saint Estèphe, you have Pomerol. Same idea. Every country has this type of distinction when they're trying to classify their wines. So Napa, despite its small size, has 16 different small AVAs within that larger region of Napa Valley. The latest one, the last one that was classified as an AVA was in 2011, and that is Coombsville. And as we go through these wines, we'll definitely kind of get specific about which areas these wines are coming from in terms of the grapes and kind of the characteristics of each one. So now let's get into the wines itself. Before we get into the wine, a couple of things I forgot to mention. Cabernet Sauvignon, interestingly enough, is actually a crossing of two grapes, a natural crossing between Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc. So basically we're talking about if vines had babies, if grapevines had babies. So basically a Sauvignon Blanc vine cross-pollinates with a Cabernet Franc vine, and you get Cabernet Sauvignon. So we get like a little new varietal. We know this because geneticists, people a lot smarter than me, have told us this. And we generally believe smarter people when they tell us things, and that's a good thing. But there are a number of varietals like this around the world. If you talk about Pinotage, if you talk about Merlot, a lot of the grapes that we commonly associate with the greatest wines that we drink have at some point or another been crossbred. For the wines itself, this club was actually a fun club to pick wines from, and it also took me quite a while because I was trying to figure out what do I want to encapsulate, what do I want to capture with the wines that we pick, and I basically came upon 2 or 3 very loose rules. I wanted to pick 3 wines that I knew I liked a lot, wines that I'm passionate about, so I could kind of pass on this passion to you. I wanted to pick stuff that was not necessarily well known, not necessarily stuff you might find at the store or things you might have tried. Otherwise, what's the point of having a club if I'm just going to give you wines that you've already tasted before? And then kind of very distinctive wines. So even though we're doing Cabernet, and actually all 3 wines happen to be from Napa, I wanted to choose 3 Cabernets that have their own distinct characteristics, their kind of own sense of history in some cases, and bring something different to the table. So the first wine we're going to talk about is the 2018 Napa Valley Mathiasen Cabernet. I chose the Mathiasen because it's, for a couple of reasons. It's a fairly new winery. The winery was established by Steve and Joe Mathiasen in 2003. They're pretty atypical for Napa, California Cabernet growers and makers. They have a very old world approach. They are farmers first and winemakers second. And what I mean by that is they take a very minimal approach or a minimalist approach to their winemaking. Basically, they see themselves as shepherds of grapes. So what that means is they want to have as little manipulation of the wine as possible. Basically, they want to take the wine from the vineyard to the winemaking facility, destem, press the grapes, and then make the wine with as little effort as possible. So basically, you're letting the grapes speak for themselves. So the quality of the wine is coming from the quality of the vineyard, essentially. They don't age in a lot of new oak. Only about 20% of this particular wine was aged in French new oak. The rest was aged in older barrels. So you really get the purity of the Cabernet Sauvignon. It's an outstandingly made wine, really well balanced. If you kind of give the wine a little swirl a little bit, a lot of you have drunk enough wine to know this aerates the wine, and then you kind of take a deep breath, and you get a lot of nice dark fruit, you get a lot of nice herbaceousness, a little spice, almost has a slight smoky flavor to it. And then if you after you aerate the wine and sit and smell it, give it a little taste. It's not overly tannic. There is some oak in there, but really well balanced. It's softer. A lot of nice fruit that you get on the palate. A little bit of spice. A little bit of that herbal, almost kind of dill mint flavor, but very subtle. Nothing kind of stands out. It is kind of a very seamless wine, which is what you want. You don't want any one characteristic to kind of jump out at you. You want that kind of seamless balance. It just makes for better wine. It's just kind of the melding of flavors and ingredients come together perfectly. So a delicious wine. And so this is labeled Napa Valley, as you can see, but it comes from 3 very specific regions or sub-regions or sub-AVAs within Napa. It comes from the grapes that they're sourcing for this wine come from Coombsville. That's that newer AVA that was established in 2011. Comes from Rutherford, and it comes from Oak Knoll District. So they are blending grapes from 3 different vineyard sites, 3 different separate AVAs, and putting it into this wine. This wine is excellent value for what you're getting out of it. It can age for about 5, 6, 7 more years easily, but I think it's something that drinks really, really well now. Mathiasen does make some single vineyard cabs, which are excellent, which are more meant for the cellaring. Some of their single vineyard stuff can go 10, 15 years easily. But it's Napa Valley with kind of an old world sensibility to it. And that's why I picked this wine. It's different, it's small production, and it's fantastic. So I hope you like it, and I hope you'll come back in and try some more of their stuff. All right, so we talked about the Mathiasen cab. Now we're going to move on to the second. The second cab we're going to talk about is the 2013 Inglenook 1882 Cabernet Sauvignon. The reason why I chose Inglenook 1882 is because A, it's a delicious wine, but B, there is no winery that exists currently that has more history in terms of Napa Valley Cabernet or United States winemaking in general than Inglenook. We're talking about going back into 1868. Gustav Neubaum, very, very important wine person in the history of California cab and American winemaking in general, arrives in the port of San Francisco with about $600,000 worth of furs, seal skins, et cetera, and $600,000 back in 1868, taken in current times, if we kind of account for inflation, comes to about a lot of freaking money. It's a lot of money back then. And he takes this money, starts a seed company, a fur trading company, and also takes another portion of this money and buys a small plot of land in what is now Napa Valley. What he wants to do with this land is create a estate, a chateau, a winery that will rival the best wineries in Europe, and in particular France. And shockingly, he succeeds. He makes millions of dollars in his other ventures, and then buys some Cabernet grapes, brings some Cabernet stock over from France, plants his own vineyards, and begins producing great California Cabernet. And he's the first one to do this. His first harvest and his first production of his cab is in 1882. No coincidence that this is named the 1882 cab as an homage to that very first harvest and very first year of making his wine. So we were talking about Gustav Neubaum, his newfound wealth, what he did with that wealth, and one of his main goals with that money, with that wealth, was to create a winery that equals or surpasses the greatest chateaus of Europe, and in particularly France and Bordeaux. So in 1882, he has his first successful vintage, makes good wine, small production, word doesn't get out that much, but he's happy with his first batch. Fast forward to 1915 and the opening of the Panama Canal. What does that have to do with wine? Well, there was a big exposition, a big celebration in San Francisco with the opening of the Panama Canal. They had this huge wine tasting, which included wines from all over the world, and it included Inglenook, Gustav Neubaum's wine, and it took home 19 gold medals. So from there, the wine kind of took off. It was quickly established after that as the best Cabernet in the United States. As a matter of fact, from the years 1935 to 1964, Wine Spectator named it the best Cabernet in the country. They survived Prohibition, continued to make fantastic Cabernet, but unfortunately, high quality doesn't always mean profitability. And by the late 1960s, the wine was being funded by the ancestors of Neubaum's children with their own money. So basically, the wine is running at a loss, and they're pouring hundreds of thousands of dollars into this thing and not making any profit. So they begin to sell off the Inglenook estate piece by piece. They sell off a little bit of land here and there. Eventually, they actually have to sell off the physical chateau itself, and the world thinks, and the US thinks, that is the end of the Inglenook winery. Fast forward a little bit to 1975. It is a golden age of movies and the golden age of Hollywood. And Hollywood directors and actors and producers are starting to invest heavily into Napa Valley, Sonoma Valley, and they're beginning to buy land for wineries. And Francis Ford Coppola makes an offer that they couldn't refuse and starts to buy the Inglenook land back. As far as I know, there were no horse heads involved in this transaction. My director, Gil, he's really young. He's like 20. Do you get that joke? You know what I'm referring to? Francis Ford Coppola
French Revolution.
Made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Horse heads in the bed.
Horse heads in the bed, yep.
Famous movie. You know what movie I'm talking about?
No idea.
It's The Godfather, buddy. Come on. This is what happens. All right. So I just made two really bad jokes about The Godfather, and my young director here had no idea what the reference was to, which makes me very sad and very old. When I asked him about The Godfather, he said, quote, "I fall asleep every time I will try to watch that movie." So let's move on. Francis Ford Coppola invests and starts buying up plots of land that used to be Inglenook. Now, he doesn't have the rights to the name, and to his credit, he's not one of these passerby investors who are just using this winery as a tax write-off. He actually wants to reestablish Inglenook as a winery. He wants to recreate that history, and he doesn't only want to buy the land back and start making wine. He wants to also bring back the quality and the name of Inglenook. And he's successful, but it takes him decades and decades to do this. As I said, he begins to buy back parcels of the land, and it's not until 1978, so about 3 years after he buys the first parcel of land, that he starts to make his own wine. And his own wine is called Neubaum Coppola Rubicon. That's the first wine that Francis Ford Coppola and his winemakers make, 1978. So he cannot use the name Inglenook, so instead he's calling it Neubaum Coppola, and the first wine is Rubicon, which is still around today. And for years and years, these wines are called Coppola wines, or Coppola Neubaum, or Neubaum Coppola. By 1997, Francis Ford Coppola continues to acquire the lands. He finally actually is able to buy the old physical chateau, and now he's kind of put everything back together. In 2011, he actually buys the rights to the name and changes the name of the winery from Coppola Neubaum back to Inglenook. And over the course of 40, 50 years, he's able to do what he started off trying to do. he recreates, he brings back the great name of Inglenook. Not only the name, but the fantastic quality of the wine. And that's what you see today. This 1882 is the 2013 vintage. It is kind of the higher middle tier of Inglenook's winery in terms of the wines that they release. It is drinking perfectly right now. The 2013, I would drink now in the next 2 or 3 years. It is kind of softened up tremendously. The tannins are not as structured and muscular as they used to be. You still get a lot of nice kind of ripe cherry fruit. You get some saddle leather, some tobacco. So some of those secondary characteristics are really taking off at this point. The wine still maintains really good color. I always do this when I'm tasting an older wine, because looking at the rim of the liquid, you could kind of get a sense of how old the wine is if you didn't know. As it ages, especially Cabernet, it'll go from kind of deep dark purple to almost kind of red brick and a tawny color around the edges. And so this still has good color, but you kind of see, possibly, or do it yourself at home, that it's turned this kind of orangish tawny color, which is indicative of a wine that's kind of started to age a little bit. Yeah, and on the palate, you kind of get what you want to get out of a nice older Cabernet. There's still fruit there, which is a good sign. When a wine loses all its fruit, it's probably past its prime. The tannins are a little softer. I do get some nice cedar, some nice spice. It still has a little bit of structure, has good acidity, so it's really well balanced. It's something I would definitely drink now, like I said, or within the next 5 years. Pair it with a nice ribeye, a New York strip. It would be perfect with a rack of lamb. It's something I highly recommend. And yeah, again, enjoy the wine. All right, so we just got finished tasting the Inglenook 1882 Rutherford Cab. Now we're moving on to the ringer of the group. This is big, classic, beautiful, well-structured Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. We're talking specifically about the 2017 Cliff Lady Stag's Leap District Cabernet Sauvignon. So again, I've kind of mentioned AVAs earlier in the video. So now we're in one of the most famous Napa AVAs, the Stag's Leap District. Stag Leap is kind of famous. There's a famous expression for Stag's Leap, same expression for Margaux in Bordeaux, where the cabs produced out of Stag's Leap have this great tannic structure and muscularity to them, but also maintains this elegance to it. So the expression is often, you know, iron fist in a velvet glove, where you got this muscularity in the wine, but also this kind of softness. This is a wine that, you know, Cliff Lady, all the bells and whistles, all the modern technology. This was started in 2002 by a Canadian named Cliff Lady, and focused on Cabernet and Cabernet-based wines, and they've just been killing it ever since they've released their first wine. When Cliff Lady bought the winery, he had a man named David Abreu kind of uproot all the old vines in the vineyard he bought and replant it. David Abreu is one of the best vineyard managers in all of California. He also makes a wine, Abreu, an eponymous wine, that is also considered some of the best in California, but he was the vineyard manager initially when Cliff Lady first opened. And the winemaker is a guy named Christopher Tynan. Now, Christopher Tynan is one of the best winemakers in California and has an incredible pedigree. You know, if you ever watch basketball or football, announcers will oftentimes talk about coaching trees. You know, for example, Bill Belichick comes from the Bill Parcells coaching tree, or Steve Kerr comes from the Greg Popovich coaching tree. So we're talking about pedigree here, and with Tynan's pedigree, we're talking about the very best in California. He made wine with Helen Turley at Blanquier, Helen Turley is probably the best winemaker in California in the last 20, 30 years. He made wine with Ann Colgan, who you could also say that about, although her focus has been very more narrow compared to Helen, who makes wine and has made wine all over California. So we're talking about outstanding pedigree. And since Tynan has come on, a number of Cliff Lady wines have received perfect 100-point ratings, in particular the Cliff Lady Poetry. The Cliff Lady Stag's Leap is our quote-unquote flagship wine. It comes in at a price of about $70 or so, which for Cliff Lady is actually very reasonable. It is a tremendous wine. It's a wine that right now is drinking pretty young. If you want to compare this to the Inglenook, the 1882 that we poured previously, it's a lot deeper, darker color. It's purple, almost ink-like in the glass itself. And if you kind of look at the rim, it's still dark to a little bit ruby red on the edge. So that's very indicative of a wine that's still very, very young. If you kind of swirl this a little bit, man, there's so much going on in this wine. It's vanilla, charred smoke, earth, a lot of dark fruit to it. Man, there's a lot going on. So taste this a little bit. And I don't know if the camera picks up the sound. I make this very disturbing, disgusting sound when I drink wine. Kind of sounds like I'm swishing mouthwash around in my mouth. And that's kind of what I'm doing. I want the wine to coat my entire palate, different parts of your mouth and different parts of your tongue, pick up different taste sensations. So I want the wine to get into the sides of my mouth. I want the wine to coat my entire tongue. First and foremost, I get tannin. So as I'm swishing it around in my gums and down the middle of my tongue, I have this drying out sensation. That's what tannin is. And the tannin is pretty prevalent here. But I also get a lot of what I got on the nose. I still get a lot of nice fruit. I still get a lot of oak. I still get a little smokiness. I still get a little earthiness and spice. That slightly charred gaminess to it. But this is a big wine. If you want to drink this wine now and compare it with the other two you've drank, that's a great taste experiment. But truth be told, I would hold on to this wine for the 10, 15 years and just let it settle down, let some of those tannins dissipate, and you'll really be rewarded for your patience. However, if you're like me, you probably won't be able to wait. It is certainly enjoyable now, but in 10 or 15 years, this will be absolutely beautiful. Cliff Lady, 2017 Cabernet Sauvignon from Stag's Leap District. Killer Juice, the ringer of these three wines.